October 17th, 1805. In the imperial palace of newly independent Haiti, an extraordinary funeral procession winds through the capital. 8 soldiers carry a coffin draped in silk. The Empress herself, dressed in black mourning clothes, leads the ceremony. The entire court has stopped to pay respect. But here's what makes this moment absolutely revolutionary. The woman being honored with this state funeral was born a slave. Her name was Abdatoya, though history would know her by many names: Victoria Montu, Adbaraya, Aunt Toya. Just 1 year earlier, she had been crowned Duchess of Haiti by Emperor Jean-Jacques Dessalines himself. But titles couldn't capture what she really was. She was the last of the Dahomey Amazons. A warrior woman captured from the most feared all-female army in African history. And she was the secret architect of Haitian independence. Because here's the story they don't teach you. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the man who defeated Napoleon's armies and created the first free black nation in the Americas, learned everything he knew about warfare from a grandmother who refused to be broken by slavery. Abdatoya didn't just survive the Middle Passage, she weaponized it. When French colonists thought they had purchased a field hand, they had actually imported a master of war. She trained the future emperor in knife combat, taught him the psychological warfare techniques of African military tradition, and when revolution came, she led troops into battle with a scythe in one hand and healing herbs in the other. This is the story of how a Dahomey Amazon became the hidden force behind history's only successful slave revolution. How a woman who was supposed to be property became the teacher of liberation. How a captive became a general. If you want to understand the real story of how enslaved Africans defeated European empires, if you want to discover the women warriors history tried to erase, if you want to know what resistance actually looks like, you need to subscribe right now. Because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about slavery, revolution, and the power of one extraordinary woman. This is the untold story of Abdatoya, the Amazon who forged an emperor. To understand how Abdatoya became the hidden architect of Haitian independence, you need to understand what it meant to be a Dahomey Amazon in 1739, the year she was born in the kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin. The Dahomey Amazons weren't mythical warriors from Greek legends. They were the most lethal military force in West Africa, an all-female army that European visitors described as superior to male soldiers in both discipline and ferocity. French officers who fought them in the 1890s admitted these women were the equals of European troops. The Dahomey called them nanon-miton, our mothers. But these mothers were trained killers. From childhood, Abdatoya would have undergone training that makes modern special forces preparation look gentle. Amazon recruits jumped over walls covered with thorny acacia branches until their bodies were carved with scars. They were sent into the jungle for 10 days with nothing but a machete, learning to survive on raw skill and psychological toughness. The Dahomey Amazons served one purpose: protecting their king and expanding his territory through warfare. They took a vow of celibacy, remaining married only to the kingdom. Any man who touched an Amazon without permission faced immediate execution. By the time Abdatoya reached adulthood, she was likely a member of the nanon-miton's elite units. Perhaps the Niekplojento, the reapers who carried razor-sharp knives and were known as the most feared regiment in the army. Or the Gabeto, the huntresses skilled in tracking and killing both animals and humans. These women were more than soldiers. They were healers, advisors, and guardians of Dahomey's military traditions. They studied herbalism, psychology, and the spiritual dimensions of warfare that European armies never understood. But in 1739, something went wrong. The exact circumstances of Abdatoya's capture remain lost to history, but the evidence suggests she was taken during a raid or battle and sold to European slave traders operating along the West African coast. For the Europeans, She was just another piece of human cargo. They had no idea they had captured one of Africa's most elite warriors. The Middle Passage, that horrific journey across the Atlantic, was designed to break people completely. Hundreds of enslaved Africans were chained in the ship's belly, forced to lie in their own waste, fed barely enough to keep them alive. Many died. Others went insane. Abdatoya survived. But more than that, she watched. She studied. She learned. She observed how European ships functioned, how their crews operated, how their weapons worked. She memorized the routines and weaknesses of her captors. She was already planning for war before she ever set foot in Haiti. When the slave ship reached the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, what would become Haiti, Abdatoya was sold to the Cormier sugar plantation. The French colonists thought they had bought a strong field worker. They had actually purchased a weapon of mass destruction with a 20-year delay fuse. But Abdatoya's true purpose wouldn't become clear until she met a young enslaved man whose mother was dying. A boy who would grow up to become the Emperor of Haiti. His name was Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The relationship between Abdatoya and Jean-Jacques Dessalines began with a dying woman's final wish. Marie Elizabeth, Dessalines' mother, was succumbing to the brutal conditions of plantation life. As her strength failed, she entrusted her son to the woman everyone called Aunt Toya, the strong, mysterious field worker who seemed to know things others didn't, who could heal wounds with plants no one else recognized, who carried herself with a dignity that slavery couldn't touch. Dessalines was just a boy when his mother died, but already he showed signs of the rebellious spirit that would eventually defeat Napoleon's armies. The plantation owners regularly punished him for his defiance. They beat him for talking back, whipped him for slowness in the fields, branded him as incorrigible. That's when Abdatoya began his real education. By day, she worked the sugar fields like any other enslaved person. But at night, in the quiet spaces between supervision, she taught Dessalines everything she had learned as a Dahomey Amazon. Hand-to-hand combat first, how to kill with bare hands when weapons weren't available, how to use farming tools as weapons. A hoe could become a battle axe, a cane knife could decapitate an enemy, even a wooden stick could break bones if you knew the pressure points. She taught him knife throwing, a skill that Dahomey Amazons had perfected for close-quarters assassination. How to balance the blade, how to calculate distance and rotation, how to kill silently and efficiently. But the physical training was just the beginning. Abdatoya understood that successful warfare required mental preparation. She taught Dessalines the psychological techniques that made Dahomey Amazons so feared, how to suppress pain, how to channel rage into focused violence, how to maintain clarity during chaos. She shared the military philosophy of the Anonmiton, that warriors must be willing to die for freedom, that courage came from accepting death as preferable to slavery, that true strength came from protecting something greater than yourself. Most importantly, she taught him to study his enemies. Just as she had observed her European captors during the Middle Passage, Dessalines learned to watch the plantation owners, memorize their routines, identify their weaknesses. The plantation owner, Henry Duclos, began to notice the unusual relationship between the Amazon and the young rebel. Their closeness made him nervous. Enslaved people weren't supposed to form strong bonds. That led to conspiracy and resistance. So Duclos separated them. He sold Dessalines to a free black man named Jean-Baptiste Dessalines, who gave the young man his surname and eventually his freedom. But the damage was already done. Abdatoya had created something far more dangerous than a field rebel. She had trained a general. Meanwhile, Abdatoya continued her double life. By day, she appeared to be just another aging enslaved woman. She worked in the plantation hospital, using her knowledge of African herbalism to heal injured workers. She cooked for the sick, tended wounds, and appeared to be a model of compliance. But at night, she was planning revolution. Abdatoya used her position as healer to build networks across the plantation. Injured workers became intelligence sources. Her knowledge of medicinal plants also included their poisonous properties. She could heal or kill with equal skill. She organized small acts of resistance, work slowdowns, equipment sabotage, the gradual organization of enslaved people into cells of mutual support and protection. When the Great Slave Rebellion began in 1791, Abdatoya was ready. She had spent over 50 years in Haiti, building networks, training fighters, and waiting for the moment when her war skills would be needed again. That moment had finally come. August 1791. The drums began beating in the mountains of northern Saint-Domingue, carrying a message that would shake the foundations of the colonial world. The enslaved had risen. But this wasn't a spontaneous uprising of desperate people. This was a carefully coordinated military campaign, planned and executed by people who understood warfare, people like Abdatoya. When the rebellion erupted, Abdatoya was already in her 50s, ancient by the standards of plantation life. Most enslaved people her age were broken by decades of forced labor. But Abdatoya was just returning to her true profession. She immediately set about creating her own military unit. Drawing on contacts she had built across multiple plantations, she assembled approximately 50 fighters, a mix of African-born people who remembered freedom and Creole-born enslaved people who were ready to fight for it. But Abdatoya's approach to warfare was unlike anything the French colonists had seen. She combined traditional Dahomey Amazon tactics with the guerrilla techniques necessary for slave rebellion. Her fighters moved through the mountains like ghosts. They struck plantation houses at dawn, liberated enslaved people and weapons, then disappeared into the forest before colonial troops could respond. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to set ambushes that devastated French patrols. Most importantly, Abdatoya understood that this was as much a psychological war as a physical one. The mere presence of a female military commander challenged everything Europeans believed about African capabilities and gender roles. French colonists wrote horrified letters describing the Amazon, who led attacks with a scythe in one hand and a machete in the other. They couldn't comprehend how an enslaved woman could display such tactical sophistication. But Abdatoya's most crucial contribution wasn't her own military leadership. It was the general she had trained. Jean-Jacques Dessalines had risen rapidly through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army. His combination of tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness made him indispensable to the rebellion's leadership. But those who knew him understood that his military genius came from the African warrior traditions that Abdatoya had preserved and transmitted. When Dessalines achieved battlefield successes that amazed even experienced European officers, he was applying lessons learned from a Dahomey Amazon. When he demonstrated the psychological toughness that allowed him to continue fighting despite horrific casualties, he was channeling the warrior spirit that Abdatoya had instilled in him. The relationship between teacher and student continued throughout the revolution. Abdatoya served as an unofficial advisor to Dessalines, providing counsel on military strategy and helping him navigate the complex politics of the revolutionary leadership. She also continued her work as a healer. While other commanders focused purely on military objectives, Abdatoya established field hospitals where wounded fighters could recover. She trained other women in medical techniques, creating a support network that kept the revolution functioning. But as the war intensified, Abdatoya found herself facing increasingly dangerous assignments. French forces had begun specifically targeting the rebellion's leaders, and the Amazon who commanded her own unit had become a high-value target. In one of her final battles, French records describe an engagement where a small rebel force led by an African woman of advanced age held off a much larger colonial unit. The woman fought with such ferocity that she wounded 2 soldiers with her bare hands before finally being overwhelmed and captured. That woman was Abdatoya. At an age when most people could barely walk, she was still fighting hand-to-hand combat against armed soldiers, but even in defeat, she refused to be broken. The French soldiers who captured Abdatoya expected her to beg for mercy. They had dealt with plenty of captured rebels who collapsed under the threat of execution, who offered information in exchange for their lives, who broke under torture and revealed the locations of rebel camps. Abdatoya was not like other prisoners. When they demanded information about rebel positions, she remained silent. When they threatened execution, she showed no fear. When they offered her freedom in exchange for betraying her comrades, she refused to even acknowledge their words. The French couldn't understand what they were dealing with. In their experience, enslaved people were supposed to be grateful for European civilization, terrified of punishment, eager to please their masters. This old African woman displayed none of those characteristics. What they didn't realize was that they had captured someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As a Dahomey Amazon, Abdatoya had been trained to accept death as preferable to surrender. The non-Mitan warrior code taught that capture was temporary, but betrayal was permanent. Death was just another journey, but dishonor lasted forever. So when French officers pressed her for information, Abdatoya gave them nothing. When they tortured her for intelligence about rebel plans, she endured pain that would have broken younger people. When they sentenced her to execution, she faced death with the calm dignity of someone who had never truly been enslaved. French military records from this period describe their frustration with captured rebels who displayed what they called African fanaticism, the incomprehensible willingness to die rather than submit. What they were actually witnessing was the continuation of African warrior traditions that Europeans had tried but failed to destroy. But Abdatoya's capture created a crisis for the revolutionary leadership. The woman who had trained their most successful general, who had served as a crucial link between different rebel factions, who embodied the African military traditions that gave them their edge over European forces, was about to be executed. Jean-Jacques Dessalines couldn't let that happen. Historical records suggest that Dessalines organized a rescue mission specifically to save his teacher and mentor. The details remain unclear, but somehow, Abdatoya was liberated from French custody and returned to rebel-controlled territory. The reunion between the student and teacher marked a turning point in their relationship. Dessalines was no longer the young man who had learned knife combat in the plantation quarters. He was now the supreme military commander of the revolutionary forces, the general who would eventually defeat Napoleon's armies and declare Haitian independence. But he never forgot who had made his rise possible. As the war entered its final phase, Abdatoya transitioned from active combat to an advisory role. Her decades of experience, her understanding of both African military traditions and European weaknesses made her invaluable in planning the campaigns that would ultimately drive the French from Haiti. She helped design the strategies that culminated in the Battle of Vertières on November 18, 1803, the decisive engagement that ended French control over the colony. When Dessalines declared independence on January 1, 1804, creating the Republic of Haiti, Abdatoya had lived to see the impossible, the first successful slave revolution in human history. But for the woman who had spent over 60 years fighting for this moment, independence was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her greatest honor. January 1st, 1804. As Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared Haiti's independence from France, creating the first free black nation in the Americas, one of his first acts as head of state was deeply personal. He gave Abdatoya the title of Duchess. This wasn't just ceremonial recognition. In a society where social status had been determined by race and slavery, elevating a former enslaved woman to the rank of Duchess was a revolutionary act. It declared that the new Haiti would honor those who had sacrificed for its freedom, regardless of their origins. But the title also reflected something deeper. Dessalines' recognition that Abdatoya had been the architect of his success. Every battlefield victory, every strategic breakthrough, every moment of courage under fire, all of it traced back to lessons learned from a Dahomey Amazon in the plantation quarters of his youth. Abdatoya spent her final months living in Dessalines' imperial palace, cared for with the respect due to a royal family member. The emperor often consulted with her on matters of state, understanding that her lifetime of experience and cultural wisdom made her counsel invaluable. She had survived the Middle Passage, endured decades of slavery, trained the future emperor, led troops in battle, been captured and freed, and lived to see the impossible dream of liberation become reality. At nearly 70 years old, she had accomplished what no other person in her position had ever achieved. But Abdatoya's health was failing. The accumulated physical damage of a lifetime of hard labor, warfare, and resistance was finally taking its toll. When it became clear that her time was ending, Dessalines spared no expense in attempting to save her life. He brought in the finest doctors available, offered rewards for anyone who could heal her, and personally oversaw her medical care. But some battles cannot be won through strength or strategy. Abdatoya died in October 1805, just 1 year after witnessing Haiti's independence. What happened next was unprecedented in the Americas. Dessalines ordered a state funeral for a former enslaved woman. This had never been done before in any society built on racial slavery. The Empress herself, Marie-Claire Heureuse Félicité, dressed in black mourning clothes and led the funeral procession. 8 soldiers carried Abdatoya's coffin through the capital, while the entire imperial court paid their respects. The funeral was more than a personal tribute. It was a political statement that the new Haiti would honor African heritage and recognize the contributions of those whom slavery had tried to render invisible. But perhaps most importantly, it was Dessalines' final gesture of gratitude to the woman who had shaped him, the emperor who had defeated Napoleon's armies, who had created a free black nation, who had proven that enslaved people could overthrow their oppressors, understood that none of it would have been possible without his teacher. The state funeral that brought the imperial court to a halt was really a graduation ceremony. The student was honoring the teacher who had made everything possible. Abdatoya was buried with the honors due to a general and the respect due to a queen. Her grave became a site of pilgrimage for Haitians who understood that their freedom had been won not just through the famous battles they learned about in school, but through the quiet teaching and preparation that had happened in slave quarters, where a Dahomey Amazon had refused to let her warrior traditions die. The story of Abdatoya forces us to completely reimagine what we think we know about slavery, resistance, and the power of individual action to change history. This wasn't a woman who was broken by the slave trade and then somehow found the strength to resist. This was a trained warrior who was temporarily captured but never defeated, who used her enforced exile to prepare for the war she always knew would come. Her story reveals the hidden networks of African military knowledge that survived the Middle Passage. When European colonists thought they were importing agricultural workers, they were actually bringing trained soldiers who carried the combat techniques and psychological preparation of Africa's most sophisticated armies. Every successful slave rebellion, every act of resistance, every moment when enslaved people demonstrated the tactical intelligence that amazed their oppressors, all of it had roots in African military traditions that people like Abdatoya had preserved and transmitted. But more than that, her story challenges everything we think we know about women's roles in historical struggles for freedom. This wasn't a woman providing support for male leaders. This was a female general who trained the emperor and commanded troops in her own right. Abdatoya proved that resistance was never futile, that knowledge was always power, and that sometimes a single person's refusal to be broken could change the course of world history. Today, when we talk about the Haitian Revolution, we celebrate Toussaint Louverture's tactical brilliance and Jean-Jacques Dessalines' military victories. But we should also remember that behind every great leader was a teacher, and behind Haiti's independence was a Dahomey Amazon who understood that freedom was something you had to fight for, generation after generation. If this story inspired you, if you want to learn about other women warriors who shaped history, If you believe these stories of resistance deserve to be told, subscribe now. Because the world is full of hidden heroes whose stories are waiting to be discovered. Abdatoya's war is over, but her legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept that oppression is permanent, that freedom is impossible, or that ordinary people can't change the world. The Amazon's spirit endures.